So we established the landscape for the game of business in the last session. Now we're going to dig into the details behind that. The first place I'm actually going to start is culture. Why culture rather than vision? Well, there is a good reason for that. First of all, Peter Drucker said some years ago, culture eats strategy for breakfast. And if we look at the premise behind that 9 ways of systemizing the business and the gameplay that I talked about, it's actually the culture which drives our differentiation in the marketplace, isn't it? The Apple example that I gave you was a function of culture and process, but a function of culture because it was how they did what they did that made the difference. So if you think about it, well, the culture in a business, there's always going to be one, whether you build it or it builds itself. Now, Patrick Lencioni, in his great book, The Advantage, talks about culture, and he essentially defines his 4 different types. Number 1, core values. So the core values are the 4 to 5 differentiating factors that should exist in everybody in the business. Second type is permissioned play values. So they're things like honesty, for example, that you just expect to be there. They don't differentiate you. They're an expected value that it needs to exist for you just to even get on the bus. The third type is aspirational values. So they're the things that you'd like to have, but they're not built in yet. And the fourth type, and this is the most interesting type for me, is the accidental values. So accidental values are things that are built within your culture that really shouldn't be there. Because remember, everybody in the business is a leader and they can attract followers. So a great example of what I mean by accidental culture is some years ago I was working with a printer and he hired a new office manager. And the rules in the business at the time were that every morning and every afternoon you got a 15-minute break, and essentially you took that break when it was a convenient stopping point. Now the new office manager decided in her wisdom that 10:30 would be a great time to have her morning break. So at 10:30 every morning she just downed tools and had her break, no matter what she was doing. Now at the time my client didn't catch this. So guess what happened? Well, 1 became 2, and 2 became 3, and 3 became many. And eventually the whole business ground to a halt at 10:30 every morning, which is a completely different culture to the one that existed. So that's accidental culture. And now if we don't have a system for culture, then it's easy for culture like that to creep into a business unchecked. So the first step for me is about building your culture and identifying your core values. Well, how do you do that? Well, really, our core values, if we go back to the iceberg, are the lens at which we look at the world through. It's how we make our judgments on what's right and wrong. If you wheel yourself back to when you started your business, actually, why did you attract clients to come with you? Because they liked how you did what you do. It was the how that they really liked, and then you gave them what they expected, and the two aligned. So what we're looking to do here is leverage your core values through your team. So I would say to you, your first step is to identify your core values. You can do that in a number of ways. You might be really clear on them already, or it may be you need to look at the opposite of your core value. In other words, what really makes you angry or upsets you. Because if you don't like dishonest people, then honesty is a clear core value. If you don't like people who are ignorant, then self-development may be a really important core value for you. Now what I want you to urge you to do is to come up with 4 or 5 core values. There's a way to do that online, by the way, if you aren't really sure where to start. There's a website which is Personal Values as a website, but it's personal value, VALU.es. That's the website, personalvalue.es. And that will ask you a bunch of questions about values, which after about 10 minutes will lead you to the point where you have 4 or 5 core values defined. Those should be your recipe of values, which will help you differentiate yourself in the marketplace. Now for me, my core values are balance, which is why I've never worked full-time in this business. That was a very definite choice. It's really important to me to balance that bubbles I showed you back in the identity iceberg session of the me bubble, the business bubble, and the family bubble. Those 3 have to be in balance. So balance is a primary core value. Personal development is the second one. So personal development is about that continuous learning. Resilience is the third one. I never give up on anything. The fourth one is integrity. So I always do what I say I'm going to do, even if it hurts sometimes. And the fifth one is genuine care for people. So when I put those 5 things together, it very much shapes the way that I drive my business and do my business. Those are my core values. It's really important to me to have people who share those core values with me in my business. So now that I'm clear on them, I can recruit based on them, and I can test for those things. I can also use them as the centre of my culture, so we can talk about it on our website. We can talk about it in our rules of the game. In other words, I build that culture. So the first step is to identify your core values. The second step is, because a set of words like balance and personal development, they're just words. What do they mean? So turn them into rules of the game. So the rules of the game in my business, there are 9 rules for the 5 core values that I've identified. The rules all start with the word I. So it's very much about, this is how I should behave in the context of this rule. Those 9 rules create a culture statement. Now, how often do I talk about that? When somebody new joins the business, all the time. I'm constantly referring to it. So that's the informal culture building piece. I also have an analysis tool where every 6 months I get each of my team to score themselves against each of my 9 rules of the game and explain why. Without looking at their score, I do the same. And then we have a conversation between the 2 of us as to how do we perceive the performance. And by the way, I get them to score me as well. So our rules of the game get built. Then the rules of the game drive behaviours, and we can hold people accountable to those behaviours through the rules of the game. What should be there? What shouldn't be there? Now, a really nice exercise based on this is something that we call setting the bar. When you've identified your 4 or 5 core values, what can be an interesting thing to do is think about what's the expected level of performance for each of those core values. So red, the value isn't there. Well, if it's a core value, then that's not going to work, is it? Amber is, we'd expect the value to be there, but it doesn't have to be there all the time. Green is, that value has to be there all of the time. So if you jot your core values across the top of a piece of paper and determine your bar, so it may be 3 greens and 2 ambers, for example, out of your 5 core values, then list your team down the side of the paper and evaluate them on a red, amber, green basis against your core values. Now, if you score somebody red, I've never seen an instance where somebody has been scored a red on a core values evaluation and stayed in the business, just for you to know. I've often had people make excuses about why they should stay, but it's never resulted in them staying. If somebody scores an amber against something that you've benchmarked as green, it means they do have the value, you just need to help them realign their behaviour so it exists more of the time. And obviously if it's somebody scores green, then they're good to go. So a really simple exercise to evaluate against your core values and a way of evaluating against your rules of the game to really ensure that you build that culture. Remember, if you don't build a culture will build itself. There are always leaders in an organisation, and quite often those leaders create some elements of accidental culture as well as the culture that we do want to exist. So we have to manage this culture carefully. So for me, the pieces of work coming out of this section are to go and define your core values. Use that website if you need to. Create your rules of the game. I've told you I've got 9 rules for my 5 core values, and then start to build your culture. Now, you don't build a culture by just putting these words on a wall or putting them in the drawer. It's something that has to be talked about again and again and again. But believe me, it's worth building a great culture in your business, because remember what Peter Drucker said, culture eats strategy for breakfast. And if people are aligned and engaged and behaving the way that you want them to behave, the rest will pretty much take care of itself.